Okay, so let's get things rolling. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to our chairman, George Nield, who is going to get your juices flowing.
Hi, greetings everyone. It's so nice to see you all in person. 2021 was an amazing year for space in general and commercial space in particular. There's some very exciting things happening that impact spaceports both today and in the future. But rather than going through each of the individual accomplishments, which most of us are familiar with anyway, I'd like to focus some time this morning on how we as an organization can improve and make a bigger difference going forward. Okay, a quick look at topics, a little bit about who we are and what we do, then talk about transitioning from being a good organization, which I think we are today, to being a great one. Talk about the world around us, the environment we're operating in, imagine the future a little bit, and then throw out some possibilities for priorities and goals that we'll revisit again later on today. Okay, for those who might be new joining us, GSA itself was established in 2015 with the first commercial spaceport summit, as we called it at the beginning, being held in conjunction with the inaugural SpaceCom conference in Houston. Our vision to create a global network of current and proposed spaceports that can serve as focal points and technology hubs to facilitate the growth of the space economy. Our mission, to provide members with the information, advice, and relationships needed for the successful planning, funding, development, and operation of spaceports around the world. And statement, the spaceports that we've got today, and we've had some recent signups, so I think we may need to update this chart, but when I prepared the slide, 23 different spaceports are members, and we've got associate members who are entities that provide goods and services to, or would like to provide goods and services to spaceports, and they range from law firms to architects to engineering service providers, propellant suppliers, all the rest. We also have a number of government and nonprofit members, including universities, the Aerospace Corporation, and UK Department for Transport. So some great participants there. Just a review on the kinds of things that we do as of today, providing the Spaceport Caucus, which is what we're gathered to do today. We have webinars, we have speakers, a newsletter, web pages, 6 different working groups. We'll hear from them later on today, providing information and advice, access to government industry leaders, engagement with academia, and then identifying and advocating for needed policy, law, and regulatory changes. As I listen to the group, some of the challenges that I think I'm seeing at this point include, number one, really a pretty vulnerable spaceport infrastructure out there. Most of our launches today are taking place from Cape Canaveral, from Vandenberg, and from Wallops Island, Virginia. And if you think about that, those places are known for hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, and of course you could have a launch pad accident just about any time you go. So that is leaving us as a country, frankly, rather vulnerable. We don't have the redundancy, we don't have the resiliency, we don't have the depth and the backup capabilities that we really like to have. Complicating that factor is, amazingly, there is no federal funding available today for space-related infrastructure, unlike any of the other modes of transportation. There are legal and regulatory constraints that we have to operate within. Of course, we're starting to identify problem areas now, but then that takes time to modify them, update them, and change them. An interesting one that we're hearing more of these days is some pushback from the aviation community, whether it's airlines, airports, groups like Airline Pilots Association, air traffic folks. They're all concerned that this space stuff might somehow negatively impact what they have been doing for many, many years. So we need to make sure we have up-to-date, accurate information, and then figure out how to work with those other stakeholders. And then frankly, I think one of the most significant challenges is the lack of a strategic vision that looks at what all of us are doing and would like to do in the future and figure out how it interrelates, how it can work together, how it can reinforce and provide some synergies. Along those lines, one of the things that GSA has done recently was to put together a document that we call the National Spaceport Network Development Plan, and we provided that about a year and a half ago to the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation as an input from the spaceport community on what we see as some challenges, some issues, some opportunities, and some ideas that they can factor into their thinking going forward. If you haven't seen that, I'd encourage you to take a look at it, skim through it, and if appropriate, we can update it, correct it, and improve it in the future. But this is available on our website. If it's easier, happy to email you a copy of that. So let's transition now to us as an organization and how we can do things better. I enjoy reading some organizational development and management books. One of my favorite, frankly, is a book by Jim Collins called Good to Great, and it's focused on, again, what differentiates good companies and other organizations from truly great ones. And I'd like to share some of the ideas that I found in that book. One of his stories is from the animal kingdom. It talks about foxes and hedgehogs. And again, if you look at the fox, good-looking animal, smart, can really think through things and strategize. It's fast, crafty, and when it goes after its prey, like a hedgehog, it tries lots of different techniques, hiding behind trees, bouncing out at the last minute, running fast, playing dead, all kinds of ideas. But interestingly, the hedgehog, which is kind of dowdy, funny looking, looks like a cross between a porcupine and a small armadillo, waddles when it walks, and yet it manages to escape almost every time by just rolling into a ball and having those sharp porcupine type spikes confuse the fox and leave it alone. So to summarize, the fox knows many things. The hedgehog knows one big thing. And Collins takes that basic concept and applies it to something he calls the 3 circles of hedgehog concept, including what you're deeply passionate about, what you can be the best in the world at, and then some users, what drives your economic engine. You have to have somebody that wants or needs what you're doing in order for that organization to be successful. So simplifying that just a little bit, as an organization, if you think about what are you passionate about, what do you have talents and abilities to do to make a difference, and then what is the need of the outside community? And Collins says if you take those 3 circles and look at the intersection, that's where some amazing things can happen. That's where BHAGs can happen. If you're not familiar with that term, it stands for big, hairy, audacious goals. That's Collins' terminology. Some of the characteristics include that they're big, they're daunting, they're like a big mountain to climb. They're clear and compelling. People seem to get it right away when you talk about it. And they can serve, interestingly, as a unifying focal point of effort. And it can galvanize people and create a team spirit as people are working towards that finish line. Some examples of BHAGs. Amazon had the goal of being able to take every book ever printed in any language and make it available in less than 60 seconds. Ford, in its early days, wanted to democratize the automobile. Google aspires to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. We're all familiar with President Kennedy's challenge, committing ourselves to achieving the goal before the decade was out, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Microsoft, even in its early days, wanted to put a computer on every desk and in every home, and that was just ridiculous at the time, and yet, look at where we are now. Sony wanted to embody changing the image that Japan had at the time of having products of poor quality and creating a pocket transistor radio. So those are some examples. It's not just setting something that seems impossible and then sitting back and waiting for it to happen. No, that would be a bad BHAG. Those are set with bravado. Good BHAGs are set with understanding. You need to know what's possible, what's practical, even if it is a challenging goal. Some other things to think about as an organization. It's interesting to look at the combination of entrepreneurship and discipline. If you think about a startup, it's typically very entrepreneurial. Probably doesn't have too much discipline because they're still figuring things out, right? On the other extreme, you've got hierarchical organization, lots of discipline, not so much the entrepreneurial. And sometimes you see bureaucracies that have the worst part of each, right? Low entrepreneurship, low discipline, that's not where you want to be. The opposite extreme, the great organization, has high entrepreneurship and high discipline. Even if an organization is good as what it's doing, it rapidly gets to the point where it needs to decide, do I keep doing this forever the same way, or do I change things as the world is changing? And again, Colin talks about what you want to preserve, which is core values and core purpose, and what you should be willing to change, including cultural and operating practices and specific goals and strategies. So an example would be Disney, again, which Colin characterizes as a great organization. They always try to preserve passion for creative imagination, fanatic attention to detail, abhorrence of cynicism, that Disney magic, and bringing happiness to millions. What do they change? Well, just look at their history. In the 20s, they did cartoons. Then, full-length features. 50s, it was television, like the Mickey Mouse Club. The 60s, theme parks. The 80s, dressing international. And then in the 90s, cruise lines. Very different things, and yet keeping those same items. So as we look at GSA, now where are we in the world? We've got a lot of stakeholders who are people that either depend on us, rely on us, or are interested in what we're doing as a spaceport community. And that ranges from the FAA, which grants licenses and has regulations, DoD, NASA, other government agencies, the general public, academia, prospective passengers or spaceflight participants, the industry as a whole, space-related vehicle operators and developers, the media, and the international community. And there's Congress. So lots of different folks. A common management technique in analyzing an organization is a SWOT analysis, taking a look at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. I'd like to quickly go through that. And then we had lots of time. We should roll up our sleeves and try to brainstorm and figure out what's on that list. I'm going to just throw some ideas out there and then ask you to think about it as we go through the day. And when we come back together at the end, might need to push back on some things, update it, add some other ideas. As I looked at GSA today, some of our strengths include the fact that GSA is really the only aerospace organization specifically focused on spaceports. That gives us a huge advantage. We've had a large and continuing to increase roster. We've got significant international participation, which I think is a big plus as we go forward. And our member spaceports offer a wide range of capabilities. Launch pads, runways, different kinds of vehicles, small, large, different missions, tourism, small sats, all the rest. That gives us a lot of depth and opportunities. Some weaknesses. As I look at government leadership right now, there are few, if any, spaceport champions out there. There have been some strong space supporters in the past. Many of those have been tied specifically to NASA centers or NASA programs, which is great. But spaceports themselves, not so much. And another key aspect that's probably related to that, there's a lack of government funding for space-related infrastructure. You already mentioned it. They're doing their best to improve, we got it, but the current spaceport licensing process can take years. And Camden, Georgia is a perfect example of that. And there's others too, Colorado. They've been trying for a long time and yet can't seem to get through the required process. And then our progress is constrained by existing policies, laws, and regulations. Just in general, frankly, government finds it hard to move at the speed of industry. That's becoming more and more visible these days. How about some threats? Well, COVID could continue or evolve, could have a major economic downturn. Fatal accident is going to cause people to stop and think, and then we'll see what happens after that. Then I mentioned this one earlier, misinformation or opposition from environmental protesters or those concerned about impacts to airlines, airports, or the national airspace system. There are so many opportunities I had to spill over to a couple of pages. We have a lot of members, but we have a lot more people that I think could really benefit and contribute to us as organizations. So I'd love to see us to look at who else can we bring into the fold, especially on the associate member side and government and nonprofits and internationals, universities, community colleges, tech training, all those kinds of things. The expected growth in the global space economy with the predictions of $1 trillion or $2 trillion over the next decade or two, that's huge. And now, as we see Virgin Galactic, Virgin Orbit, Blue Origin flying, we're going to be seeing regular suborbital science activities, suborbital and orbital space tourism, commercial space stations, commercial crew and cargo delivery, small satellites, including mega constellations, point-to-point transportation, which I think is going to be a real game changer. Human spaceflight training, huge opportunity for the future and for spaceports. And commercial space transportation and research. As I look at the other folks out there, I think there are certain organizations that we really need to think about and figure out how to strengthen our relationships. And they include with the National Space Council, which recently had its first meeting under the Biden administration on December the 1st, Department of Defense in general, and Space Force in particular, NASA, had some great things happen at the end of Administrator Bridenstine's tenure. We want to continue that. Capitol Hill in general, staffers and members, the international community. There's lots of activity and interest out there. We've captured some in our membership. There's a lot more we can do. Academia in general. This is fun, exciting stuff, and there's a prospects of jobs and training and doing exciting things, whether it's co-ops, mentorships, apprenticeships, all kinds of things that we could be doing with the academic community. There's another organization, Aerospace Space Association, that tries to hook on to the lieutenant governors in every state. Don't think we've had much interaction or heard much from them lately. I think there's some potential there. And then the news media, they offer some opportunities as well. So take a look at the future. What is it going to be like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Just go through the list, space tourism, and commercial stations, point-to-point, servicing, active debris removal, human flights to the lunar surface, lunar research stations, solar power satellites, on-orbit propellant depots, a permanent lunar base, mining operations on the moon, and human missions to Mars. There's so much going on. So let me just throw out some potential priorities. With all that activity, what kinds of things do we want to focus on for GSA over this next year? Here's some ideas. Increasing our membership. The more members we have, the more good work we can do. Development of congressional and executive branch spaceport champions. Maybe there's some out there already, we just need to write them down and get to know them better. Maybe there's some we need to talk to, educate, develop, and help become champions. I'd like to see us push for a national spaceport policy. I think that would help. Advocating for a change in the definition of space support vehicles to allow human spaceflight training, enlisting support for infrastructure funding, and working with the FAA to identify a minimum impact spaceport concept. That's something new. Everybody's different. There's no one size fits all. But as we keep bumping into problems with the environment, with air traffic, with keeping the public away, is there something we can put down, at least hypothetically, that says if you're smaller than this, you have thrust less than this, if your explosive potential is less than X, and if there's no populated areas around X number of miles, check, 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 you can get your license right away. That doesn't mean you can launch a Falcon 9. That's okay. You don't need to launch Falcon 9s to be a spaceport. So I'd like to investigate that, and maybe with Pam's help, that's something we can make some progress. And then at the end of the day, I'd like to take some of those priorities and turn them into real goals. They have to be smart, right? Specific, and measurable, and achievable, and realistic, and time-based. So we need to figure out who's going to do what, when. So maybe it's double our membership by the end of the year. Maybe it's preparing a list of our champions and a communications strategy by the middle of the year so that we can get started on that the remainder of the year. Gaining approval for a policy by the end of this year. And ensuring infrastructure funding is included in the 23 appropriations bill. Maybe that's the right list, maybe it's not. We can talk about that later on in the day. Some others, obtaining congressional approval for a change in the definition of space support vehicles, which is going to help us be able to offer human spaceflight training by the end of the year. And then gaining an agreement with the AST on how we can have a standardized minimum spaceport concept that would expedite the licensing process, at least for some potential spaceports. So, those are some ideas to think about. Want that to stimulate your thought as we go through and hear other speakers. And then we come back at the end of the day and start to lay out our plan. We can hear your reaction to that and additional thoughts that may have sparked